Hi, I'm Bill Dobbins. In this presentation, I would like to give an overview of the solo piano tradition in jazz. All the music you'll hear is from the fourth volume of my series of books, The Contemporary Jazz Pianist. In order to clearly illustrate the specific contributions of the various pianists, I first composed a theme based on the harmonic progression of the well-known standard All of Me. Then I wrote variations in the styles of 24 different pianists. Through this approach, the evolution of this musical tradition, as well as the differences between particular pianists, can be easily distinguished. I've selected 12 traditional and 12 modern pianists. In this first part, we will hear the 12 variations based on the traditional styles. The selection was rather difficult to make, but these 24 pianists are certainly among the most important who have contributed to this tradition. Each series of 12 variations moves in third relationships through all 12 keys: A flat, E, C, B, G, E flat, D, B flat, G flat, F, D flat, and A. The melody of the theme sounds like an upside-down version of the melody of All of Me. Except for the variations in the styles of Duke Ellington and Meade Lux Lewis, the essential movements of this chord progression can be heard in each variation. Even though there are many harmonic embellishments and alterations, the basic chord progression is always there. This is how the theme sounds. Whether ragtime is considered as the first jazz style or as a pre-jazz style, Scott Joplin is undoubtedly the most important ragtime pianist. Many of his well-known compositions, such as Maple Leaf Rag and The Entertainer, are still frequently performed. Ragtime music is actually like syncopated march music. Unlike the early jazz styles, the eighth notes or 16th notes are interpreted strictly rather than with a swing conception. As in the music of many of the early jazz soloists, the role of improvisation is usually limited to melodic ornamentation. In this first variation, I've used the most common ragtime form, which is similar to that of the military march, and might be represented by the letter scheme A-A-B-B-A, C-C-D-D. In the first theme, there's a quote from a famous ragtime composition of Henry Fillmore called Lassus Trombone. Jelly Roll Morton was the first important jazz composer as well as one of the first true jazz pianists. Morton's well-known compositions, such as Jelly Roll Blues, King Porter Stomp, and Black Bottom Stomp, are still heard today. In different recorded versions of the same pieces, the solos of Morton's sidemen are often nearly identical, while his own solos are always quite different. From Morton up to today, most jazz pianists play their eighth notes with the loose, relaxed feeling commonly referred to as swing. In early jazz piano styles, the left hand plays the same role as in ragtime, playing bass notes on the first and third beats and chords on the second and fourth beats. Morton's piano style, however, sounds like an entire New Orleans-style jazz band. His left hand implies the syncopated bass lines which are characteristic of Dixieland trombonists. The rhythmic and melodic aspects of his right hand are reminiscent of the cornetists and clarinetists of the early jazz bands. Morton also liked to use his left hand like a bass drum. This dissonant cluster effect was used in a similar manner 40 years later by Horace Silver and Cecil Taylor. The introduction of this variation, typical of Morton, begins with a harmonic surprise. In the first theme, there's a quote from his composition, Grandpa's Spells. James P. Johnson was known as the father of stride piano. Stride style is closely related to ragtime, but was played with a looser, more swinging feeling, and often at faster tempos. Johnson's most famous composition, Carolina Shout, was often used in the so-called cutting contests, which jazz pianists of the 1920s and 1930s loved to engage in. Johnson liked to group his left-hand stride pattern in groups of 3 quarter notes. Instead of a bass note followed by a chord, he He often played two bass notes followed by a chord. This implies a 3/4 cross rhythm, which creates rhythmic tension. Johnson also liked to play two notes simultaneously which were only a half step away from one another. In this way, jazz pianists can imply so-called blue notes, which actually are located somewhere in between these two notes. Unlike Jelly Roll Morton, Johnson often saved the biggest harmonic surprise for the end of the piece. Willie the Lion Smith was one of the first pianists to use impressionistic harmonies. Pieces written by Smith during the 1930s, such as Echoes of Spring, Morning Air, and Rippling Water, were powerful influences on the young Duke Ellington. In Ellington's portrait of the Lion and Smith's portrait of the Duke, these musical giants expressed their mutual admiration. Smith used quarter note triplets in a particularly interesting way. By starting them on the second or fourth beat, the feeling of the bar lines is obscured and a kind of rhythmic tension is created. This variation ends with the rhythmic signature which was most characteristic of Smith's solo performances. Hines is one of the most important early jazz pianists. His right hand was so melodic that his style was often called trumpet style. He may have been inspired by his father, who played the trumpet. Hines used all the common tricks of the early horn soloists, such as stop-time effects, unaccompanied rhythmic melodies known as breaks, double-time feeling, and so on. Like many of the early pianists, he used the tremolo to imitate the horn player's vibrato. Instead of single bass notes or octaves, Hines often played tenths in the left hand, which resulted in a fuller, richer sound. As far as rhythmic complexity is concerned, Hines was the most advanced pianist to appear before Erroll Garner and Nat King Cole. He had the ability to continually spin out fresh melodic ideas. No other early jazz pianist was so full of musical surprises. No wonder he was the only pianist who could keep up with Louis Armstrong, as their famous recordings from the late 1920s clearly illustrate. Fats Waller was so gifted as a songwriter, bandleader, and entertainer that his extraordinary pianistic abilities were often overlooked. He became the most famous of James P. Johnson's students, composing popular songs such as Honeysuckle Rose, Ain't Misbehavin', and Squeeze Me, as well as piano pieces in the tradition of Johnson's Carolina Shout. These include Handful of Keys, Alligator Crawl, and Smashing Thirds. Waller united the stride piano with the growing repertoire of American popular songs. One of his most important pianistic contributions was the use of 3- and 4-note left-hand chords, which were widely spaced within the tenth intervals used by Hines and others. This aspect of his style clearly influenced the great Art Tatum. This variation contains quotes from many of Waller's well-known songs and piano pieces. If Earl Hines was considered the Beethoven of jazz piano, Teddy Wilson would be the Mozart. Wilson possessed a light, delicate touch, but could still create a powerfully swinging pulse. His exquisite melodic taste was equaled perhaps only by Count Basie. Sometimes, especially at fast tempos, he played broken tenths and quarter notes in the left hand. This technique is well suited to fast tempos and creates an interesting transparent variation of the stride accompaniment. Wilson's gift for highly developed harmonic decorations was surpassed only by Art Tatum. His left hand can often be heard searching intently for undiscovered possibilities in even the most often played standards. This variation was inspired by his solo recordings of the 1930s. With the exception of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington is probably the most important musician in the history of jazz. He was not only the greatest of all American composers, but also the leader of a unique jazz orchestra and an incredibly imaginative pianist. Like Jelly Roll Morton, he played the piano as though it were an entire jazz orchestra. At the same time, however, he could play very convincingly in the stride, bebop, and even avant-garde styles. In the first part of this variation, we hear the colorful impressionistic harmonies used from such early works as Mood Indigo to his ballet, The River. In this part, the melody of the theme is retained, but some of the chord progression has been altered. In the second part, we hear the more dissonant blues-based aspect of his music, as heard in such works as Coco and The Clothed Woman. This side of Ellington was a strong influence on Thelonious Monk. Art Tatum was, without question, the greatest virtuoso pianist in the history of jazz. His technique was so incredible that few pianists are capable even of a bad imitation. As a result, it was his harmonic imagination which most clearly influenced later jazz pianists. In relation to harmonic extensions and altered tones, Tatum had exquisite taste. He could also modulate suddenly into distant keys and return, just on the right beat, to the form of the song he was playing. His music represents, in fact, an ongoing tradition of reharmonization of standard popular songs. This tradition was continued through a completely different pianistic conception by Bill Evans. A popular piano style which evolved parallel to the early jazz styles was known as boogie-woogie. This style is based mostly on simple 12-bar blues progressions, which are combined with a variety of repetitive bass lines or ostinatos. Boogie-woogie was one of the most important blues styles from which the earliest forms of rock and roll evolved. The first example of this style was inspired by Meade Lux Lewis. His piece Honky Tonk Train Blues was one of the most popular boogie-woogies of the 1930s. The left-hand ostinato is based on repeated chords, which create a rhythmic feeling known as a shuffle beat. In all blues-based styles, including jazz, notes are sometimes played which seem to contradict the accompanying chord. For example, the note F might be played against a C7 chord. The best musicians can hear ways of using such wrong note voicings which sound completely convincing. As Duke Ellington used to say, if it sounds good, it is good. Of course, musicians from all traditions simply use whatever sounds best to their ears. Then the theorists come along and try to figure out why it sounds good. In this variation, we hear a simple 12-bar blues progression instead of the chord progression from the theme. The melodic material, however, is based exclusively on the melody of the theme, especially the ascending triad. The next variation was inspired by Pete Johnson. It begins with a tremolo, as was often used in this style. The first 5 choruses are based on a left-hand ostinato, which was used by Johnson in such pieces as Rollin' Pete. The last chorus is based on the form and chord progression of the theme. The left hand plays broken octaves, a boogie-woogie adaptation of the so-called walking bass lines, which are commonly heard in jazz from the 1940s to the present. This particular boogie-woogie pattern sounds remarkably similar to the disco style, although it originated 50 years earlier. It is also referred to as 8 to the bar, since we hear 8 eighth notes in each measure. The last example of this style was inspired by Jimmy Yancey. The left-hand ostinato figure used in his well-known Yancey stomp is based on a rhythm which jazz drummers play on the cymbals. This rhythm, which consists of alternating quarter notes and pairs of eighth notes, is commonly called the ride rhythm. After a typical Yancey introduction and 5 choruses of blues, the left-hand ostinato figure is combined with the harmonic progression of the theme. At the beginning of this last chorus, a typical boogie-woogie send-off is used. The harmonic surprise at the end of the piece is Yancey's personal trademark. No matter which key a given piece was in, he always ended on an E-flat 7 chord. Much of the vocabulary used in modern jazz stems from the bebop style. Thelonious Monk was one of the most important pianists and composers who contributed to the development of this music during the early 1940s. However, the relationship of Monk to bebop is curiously similar to that of Ellington to swing. For Monk, the components of the bebop style represented no musical boundaries, but only tools for his creative imagination. The harsh dissonances which both Ellington and Monk used were, of course, nothing new. However, the combination of these dissonances with the melodic vocabulary of the blues inspired virtually all jazz pianists of later times. This variation pays homage to Monk's rubato style, his bent note effects, and his special brand of stride piano. Monk also had a real gift for developing his musical ideas in a logical, poetic manner. The most important student of Monk was Bud Powell. Powell was one of the few pianists to incorporate Monk's dissonances into his own convincing style. He had a technical fluidity and a clarity of articulation which was rivaled only by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. This variation illustrates his harmonic style and his long melodic lines, which often imply harmonic substitutions. There are also some melodic phrases which are harmonized in a manner known as block chord style. Oscar Peterson is probably the most convincing heir to the great legacy of Art Tatum. Peterson also incorporated elements from bebop and other contemporary vocabularies into his own style. As a solo pianist, his technical ability and harmonic imagination are truly incredible. This variation illustrates his bubbling rhythmic melodies and his melodic octave doubling. And it also features another version of the so-called block chord style, which Peterson particularly favors. Throughout much of the variation, the left-hand accompaniment contains only half notes, played in a manner which is known as a two-beat feeling. Erroll Garner is one of my personal favorites. The pure joy in every note he played is a constant source of inspiration. His left-hand accompaniment was often a pianistic adaptation of Freddie Green's so-called rhythm guitar style. In the Count Basie Orchestra, Freddie Green played quarter notes on every beat of the bar. Garner sometimes adds accented bass notes, which gives the pulse a powerful feeling of forward motion. Like Art Tatum, Garner played with equal facility in all 12 keys, and like Tatum and Peterson, he played at his best without a rhythm section, removing all obstacles from his musical imagination. On the spur of the moment, he would freely alter the form of the song or suddenly modulate into another key, and his unprepared introductions somehow always led to the theme in a logical, yet totally unpredictable manner. Lennie Tristano was one of the most important pianists of the so-called cool style. He continued the development of the long melodic line and the use of chromatic melodic development. His melodies consisted primarily of eighth notes, but his use of accents created a powerful sense of cross rhythm within these eighth note lines. Sometimes his melodies would approach an entire chord by a half step from above or below. Although he made very few recordings, many pianists were influenced by his most well-known student, alto saxophonist Lee Konitz. Elements of his style can be heard in the playing of such pianists as Bill Evans, Clare Fischer, Herbie Hancock, and Richie Beirach. In this variation, I've used the walking bass line in the left hand, as Tristano did on some of his most influential recordings. Bill Evans was one of the most influential pianists of the second half of this century. Like Monk, he had the ability to develop his melodic and rhythmic ideas with remarkable clarity, although his piano style was quite different. This aspect of his contribution has often been overlooked, since his use of impressionistic harmonies, his clarity of voice leading, and his sensitive touch have been most influential on subsequent pianists. He had a particular gift for the jazz waltz, which inspired this variation. The modulations between E flat and G, and the use of pedal points at the end of each chorus, are typical of Evans' solo recordings. The harmonic style of Clare Fischer is more chromatic than that of Bill Evans. Like Ellington, he uses several independent lines to develop his rich harmonic textures. His arrangements during the 1950s for the vocal group the Hi-Lo's were an important harmonic influence on Herbie Hancock. An essential aspect of his style is that the harmony is rarely resolved completely. There's often a new or lingering dissonance, even at the end of a phrase, which gives the music a constant feeling of forward motion. Clare combines elements from Ellington, Konitz, Alban Berg, and Shostakovich to develop a fresh and personal style. Like Ellington, Monk, and Evans, Jimmy Rolls has the special ability to reduce his music to pure essence. A swinging pulse, especially at medium tempos, is his specialty. Although elements of Waller, Ellington, and Monk can be heard in his playing, it always sounds fresh and personal. His music is deep, and he cleverly quotes from his vast repertoire of popular standards while expressing his wry sense of musical humor. This variation was inspired by his solo recordings of the music of Ellington and Strayhorn. Much of Cecil Taylor's music sounds more like the music of Stockhausen and Xenakis than Ellington and Monk. Nevertheless, Taylor has had a significant effect on creative music since the 1950s. The sheer energy of his playing literally hypnotizes the listener. In this variation, I've used the melody of the theme in the way composers of atonal music use a 12-tone row. Fragments of the melody are repeated, decorated, and separated by free cadenzas. As a result, this entire variation consists of only one stretched-out statement of the theme. Strangely, the melody seems to imply the key of G-flat quite clearly, although there are no chords which make any conventional harmonic cadences. At the end of the 1960s, Chick Corea developed a method of applying the use of pentatonic scales and chords based on fourth intervals to traditional jazz forms and standard tunes. He was strongly influenced by McCoy Tyner, although Tyner rarely recorded as a solo pianist. Tyner, however, developed this vocabulary more in relation to modal jazz and the use of pedal points or ostinatos. Corea's recording Now He Sings, Now He Sobs is one of the best examples of this style. The solo recordings for the ECM label were also quite influential. In this variation, the free introduction uses fragments of the theme in an abstract manner. Then these fragments are assembled together in the opening statement of the melody. Keith Jarrett has such a broad musical vocabulary that it would be pointless to discuss a so-called Jarrett style. As a result, this variation uses a vocabulary which is seldom heard in the playing of most jazz pianists. The lyrical phrasing and economy of means may recall the music of Chopin, but the melodic ornamentation is often more closely related to the jazz tradition. Better than any other jazz pianist, Jarrett can use even simple triadic harmony in a compelling manner. Richie Beirach has developed a strongly personal style based on pedal points, polychords, and the reharmonization of standard tunes. In this last variation, the rhythm of the theme has been altered. The new rhythm is reminiscent of Beirach's most well-known tune, Pendulum. In each half of the theme, I've used a different pedal point. These two pedal points imply relative major and minor keys, A major and F sharp minor. In the middle of the variation, fragments of the melody are freely developed, along with the use of pedal point. It would take another hour just to mention the names of the many pianists whose music has been both a lesson and an inspiration. To me, every musician's statement is personal, whether they realize it or not. Although certain pianists have become well known in relation to particular styles, they were certainly influenced by many pianists whose names have already been forgotten. In the end, it is craft and artistry, and not style and vocabulary, which determine the quality of a musical statement. And it is the search for quality, and not mere familiarity, which makes life interesting.